Hello and welcome. Do hope you're keeping safe and well. To mark the 75th anniversary of VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, I've created a short animated film, 1 Minute Silence. This is the story of the creative processes behind that film. Using only natural pigments of tea and coffee, and a variety of tools which you'll see, I loosely paint each of the figures, let them dry, and later cut them out of paper, prior to articulating and animating them digitally. The warm tones and rich, earthy colours are appropriately reminiscent of pre-colour photography. My intention is to evoke the simplicity and nostalgia of a faded bygone era. Basing my sketches on contemporary photographs and footage of VE Day 1945, I depict Winston Churchill, the royal family, and crowds of people celebrating the victory. Britain had been at war for almost 6 years, so it's no wonder that the news of Nazi Germany's defeat prompted spontaneous celebrations, with people taking to the streets to dance. To convey these energetic scenes depicting many figures, my first challenge is to create a cast of thousands. So I paint loose, freehand sketches of multiple figures, each consisting of minimal brushstrokes and a few simple marks and lines to evoke the style of dress of the period. In addition to standard black tea and coffee, I supplement my palette with red fruit and blue flower teas to indicate flags and bunting. Tea and coffee are still a quintessential part of British life. Working on this film during the COVID-19 lockdown in April 2020, putting the kettle on became more than just a reassuring habit. I began painting with tea and coffee pigments in an effort to find art materials to which everyone has access. The addition of other teas allows me to include colours: raspberry, beetroot, turmeric and butterfly pea, all of which are slightly muted in comparison with traditional watercolours. Rather than depicting the horror of warfare, the simple lowering of a tank arm in the film implies the falling silent of the guns. The tank silhouette is based on a German Tiger tank. I used a variety of tools and techniques to suggest a harsh, war-torn landscape. Blowing the fluid pigment using a drinking straw causes the paint to grow into organic, gnarled tree patterns, while spattered paint adds atmosphere. A slightly flexible plastic fork is perfect for scratching into the wet paint, rather like a palette knife. By contrast, a loosely painted cityscape forms the backdrop for scenes of VE Day celebrations. The exuberantly joyful mood is evident in footage of the time, most abundantly in city centres, with people swinging from lampposts, crowds dancing through the streets, and couples kissing passionately. This time I used the fork to suggest lines of perspective and architecture, scratching into the wet paint. I sliced up an old cardboard box. The neutral colour of corrugated cardboard complements the warm tones of tea and coffee. It also fits with the idea of making use of available materials, which is as relevant today in lockdown as it was during the war. This panel will form part of Buckingham Palace, no less. So I begin by loosely outlining the features of the facade, which will form a backdrop for the royal family, who appear in the film waving on the balcony in response to the adoring crowds. The plastic fork proves useful once again in scratching back into the paint to suggest details of architecture. Using a surgical scalpel, I begin cutting the figures out of the paper onto which I've painted them. The looseness of the sketch balances the precision of the blade, meaning that the figures can have intricately detailed features, yet still appear full of movement and character. Cutting figures out of paper may serve to remind us of what a precious resource a piece of paper was in wartime Britain. Today, in the context of lockdown, we are all having to re-establish the value of things that we have taken for granted too long, including the simplest of things, like holding hands and embracing those we love. I used other cutting tools too, where appropriate, including pattern shears. It was great fun making my own miniature festive bunting. The blades of different shears lend themselves to various uses. The mechanical patterns of these scissors seem most appropriate to suggest the solid engineering of the tiger tank, while the inevitable imperfections of the piece being cut out by hand avoid it being pedantic overall. Two young ladies running are a playful reference, albeit with artistic license, to the fact that the two princesses passed through the streets of London incognito on VE Day. What an experience that must have been for them. Inspired by contemporary footage, I painted a crowd of people of all ages, cheering and waving flags and hats outside the gates of Buckingham Palace. Similarly, I cut out long strings of figures to suggest the joyful dancing in the streets. Each of these figures had to be animated separately for the film. Just as well I had time to do this during lockdown 2020. Back to the facade of Buckingham Palace, and, using a scalpel and other tools, I peel away some of the surface of the cardboard to reveal strips of the lighter coloured corrugated material beneath. This gives the illusion of architectural detail, conveniently arranged in a regular striped pattern. Even a small screwdriver is useful for scoring the cardboard for added texture. A film about Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, would be incomplete without the figure of Winston Churchill and his famous V symbol for victory. Churchill was an accomplished amateur artist himself and one of my heroes. I hope he would have approved my efforts in this film. You have to concentrate when cutting out of paper to avoid slicing off fingers by mistake. Cutting each figure out of paper allows me to isolate it more easily in a digital context, and thereby articulate limbs and introduce animation. Lest we forget those who lost their lives in the war, poppies are an essential feature of the film, symbolising remembrance. I use a mixture of raspberry, strawberry and beetroot tea pigments to achieve a slight gradation of different reds. Instead of adding yet another colour, green, for the poppy stems, I stick to the minimal palette of colours I've already used. So I paint the stems and buds using blue matcha, which is made from finely powdered butterfly pea flowers. In places this mingles with the red to give violet. This time I use the fork to suggest the tiny delicate hairs on the poppy stems. The uses of a repurposed plastic fork are endless in the context of art. I hope you're beginning to feel inspired to have a go at some of the things I'm demonstrating here, and I wonder what other unexpected tools and techniques you'll discover in the process. If you're interested, please do watch my tea and coffee painting tutorial for more guidance. The fork is also ideal for pulling the wet pigments around on the paper and scratching into the paint to add expressive detail within each flower. These marks become much more prominent after the paint dries. The more intense the tea and coffee pigments, the more they respond to this sort of technique. The butterfly pea tea also allows me to create the blue sky backdrop. The interesting textures are the result of adding water, mopping up some of the paint, adding more water, and then allowing the paint to move and run around on the paper before laying it down carefully on a level surface to dry. The barbed wire is a subtle but important feature of the tiger tank scene, and must consist of very thin lines to look convincing. I achieved these using a glue spreader dipped into the strongest coffee pigment. A glue spreader is possibly the closest equivalent I have found to a traditional artist's palette knife, having a similar degree of flexibility, a thin edge and flat surface, along with a convenient handle. Even tight curves are possible using this experimental technique. It would be impossible to achieve this using a brush. The barbs are added using the plastic fork to print spiky marks across the wire, while the glue spreader effortlessly evokes tufts of grass at the base of the barbed wire fence. But don't take my word for it. Why not have a go at some of the techniques shown in this film and begin your own creative journey at home during the lockdown period? Last but not least, I add a dove in flight as a symbol of a more hopeful and peaceful future, as relevant today as it was in 1945. I hope you've enjoyed this short insight on my experimental creative processes. The link to the 1-minute silence film is underneath this video. If you haven't already done so, please click on subscribe for free updates about my YouTube channel. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Meanwhile, please stay home, stay safe, stay creative. Many thanks for watching.